vais présenter en anglais aujourd'hui, mais la présentation, c'est autour de... Je vais vraiment parler de la confiance numérique, mais comment on peut utiliser des outils de cybersécurité qui existent aujourd'hui pour aider à augmenter l'adoption de technologies qui amènent à la confiance numérique. So, as I switch to English here, bridging digital credentials and DNS to enable digital trust. Let's see if this works. Okay. My name is Mathieu GLAUDE. I am the CEO of a company called Northern Block. So we're a Canadian technology solutions provider in the digital trust space. What does that mean? Well, we work on digital wallets that citizens will soon hopefully be able to use. We work on digital credentials, assisting governments and other entities to be able to start issuing digital credentials of all sorts, both in the public sector and private sector, and then helping people consume digital credentials for business transformation purposes. And so you could find, if I'm on social media, if ever you want to connect with me after the presentation. So I will start the presentation off. This is a really good article. If you haven't read it, it's Flaw in the Design of the Internet. So the Washington Post published a series of blog posts in 2015 describing how the founders of the internet made trade-offs in the architecture in building the internet. And obviously the internet has had widespread adoption, big success, but doesn't have a trust layer built in. And for good reasons they didn't build it, they made these trade-offs, but we're here today to say, hey, how could we create this trust layer and so that any of us that are using the internet could use it with trust? And so we're stuck with these problems because of these architectural decisions that were made by the architects of the internet that have to do with, and all the companies that we see here are trying to solve these types of problems. And if I was to summarize them, it has to do with this acronym SPAC: security, privacy, authenticity, and confidentiality. And so these are things that are missing and all things that we're trying to solve. And so far, we've come up with all sorts of solutions. I don't have an exhaustive list of all the solutions here, but there's just some of them. And I just tried to map what types of these SPAC problems they're looking to solve. And of course, there's more of them. And again, if we look around the room here today, vendors here are trying to solve problems related to this. Probably a lot of security related problems at this event today. And what has happened is that it's created this industry of solution providers that is continuing to grow. If we look at the whole cybersecurity space, the market for vendors is continuing to grow. Companies are investing more and more money into cybersecurity solutions, but we still haven't been able to solve this SPAC problem. And so really what we're trying to do with digital trust, and I'm just going to spend a few minutes on the concept of digital trust right now. I'll get a bit more technical as we go into the presentation, and if it's too technical or it doesn't make sense, I would love to get the feedback afterwards, but I'll just try to demonstrate based on what we're seeing of what's happening today in the space, the direction that some of the technologies are going into, kind of some of the problems that we still need to solve to ensure digital trust, which is really, how do I ensure all claims made on the internet could be verifiable, validated back to their authentic origin? We have trouble doing that today, right? We receive emails that we're not sure come from the authentic sender of the email. We don't know if what they're asking for, they're actually allowed to be asking us this. We have these problems all over the place today. And so I'm trying to remember the year now, 2020, I believe, Northern Block, our company, was a founding member of a new organization called the Trust Over IP Foundation. So for those who aren't familiar with the Trust Over IP Foundation, and actually the executive director of the Trust Over IP Foundation is the director of digital trust services for the government of British Columbia. So there's a lot of Canadian presence in this thing, but really the purpose of this organization is, hey, how do we create digital trust? How do I ensure that any communication happening between any two endpoints can have security, privacy, authenticity, and confidentiality baked into them? And so what we did in this foundation is we started to look at, I talked about the architecture of the internet to begin with, but starting to look at, hey, what does the architecture of the internet look like? And the architecture of the internet is protocol-based, and you could view it here in this hourglass model, where we have protocols that are sitting higher up, like SMTP, for example, which we'll use to exchange emails. And what's interesting about having a protocol approach is that it's independent of any platform or application or client, right? If one email application like Gmail is using SMTP and another one like Outlook is using SMTP, they could talk to each other. They speak the same language. So it prevents this vendor lock-in and this centralization, right? And so you have these protocols that are sitting on top, and if we go down to the middle, kind of that thin waist is the internet protocol, IP, which just helps packets move across networks. And it's thin on purpose because this protocol is very thin by design to promote interoperability. It was to make it easy to move packets around the place, and then on top of that, other protocols could be utilized to create value for the specific context that they have, right? So we looked at this model, we looked at some of the things that don't work with this model today, which I discussed earlier in the presentation. We're not able to achieve or solve problems related to SPAC. And we came up with a model of its own for digital trust within this Trust over IP Foundation that we're actively working on today. It's an interesting organization, open community, tons of thought leaders in the digital identity and digital trust space are part of this. But we've created a similar architecture to say, hey, if we really want two endpoints to be able to talk to each other, how do we have a very thin protocol that will enable these SPAC things that I'm talking about? So any two endpoints are able to just communicate with each other. And how could we build protocols on top of it to allow for digital trust to happen? And that's when I talk about trust tasks here. So an example of a trust task could be issuing a credential, a digital credential. Examples we hear quite often. Another example could be presenting a proof of a credential. Another option could be doing a payment. So we start thinking of these trust tasks like protocols, just like the same way that the internet is architected. So I have some examples here of some protocols. Maybe I want to send secure messaging if I have this secure trust spanning channel. Maybe I want to do negotiations. Maybe I want to ask a trust registry for information. So you have a whole bunch of things, payments that you could start doing on top of this protocol. And so I won't get into the details of this trust spanning protocol. It's work that's actively happening right now. There's an architecture for it. If you go to the Trust over IP website, you'll be able to see the 7 core principles for it. And I also have a podcast, if anyone's interested. The podcast is called SSI, for Self-Sovereign Identity, SSI Orbit. And on one of the recent episodes, I talk with one of the folks behind the trust spanning protocol just to make it easier to comprehend how we're going to achieve digital trust in a widespread fashion that way. But the one key principle, which is the first pillar of the trust spanning protocol, is the concept of a verifiable identifier. So just like on the internet today, we have IP addresses that help route packets to each other and send information between each other. We have the concept of a verifiable identifier, which is different than most identifiers that we use in our daily lives today that are handed to us by organizations. They're not really controlled by us. The whole purpose of this is we're able to be self-sovereign. We're able to generate identifiers ourselves that have cryptographic verifiability kind of built into the whole thing. And there's a standard by the World Wide Web Consortium around, it's called decentralized identifier, which is a type of verifiable identifier. There's many types of this, but this is one I'll just use for the example today because it's one that we're seeing that is getting used and adopted more and more by anyone that's looking to implement digital trust solutions like digital credentials, for example. And then, like I just explained, once we're able to use these identifiers and form these secure, private, authentic, and confidential channels between each other, we could start executing trust tasks based on the context. And so what happens here is that so far what I've been able to do, we're trying to achieve digital trust, right? So how do we achieve digital trust? Well, one is achieving technical trust. So if I've been able to establish cryptographic verifiable trust between two endpoints using the trust spanning protocol, using decentralized identifiers and other stuff, which I would say if you're interested, go to the Trust over IP website to read that. We've achieved technical trust that I know a claim hasn't been altered since it was made, right? It kind of has a property of immutability if we want to look at it that way. I have confidence technically through cryptography that it hasn't been altered. So we've been able to do that. That's fantastic. Just having signatures and cryptography and more stuff just advances us big time over how a lot of things are done today. But there's a couple other things that I still haven't achieved here. And I'm going to use a digital credential exchange example as I explain this to explain how we achieve these two things. And that's where I'm going to use that DNS example as one tool of how we could use tools like DNSSEC to help us achieve these human trust problems. So it's great that I have cryptographic verifiability, but how do I achieve human trust, like knowing that the claim was made by the party who I think it actually is, right? If the SAC in Quebec is issuing digital driver's licenses to citizens, how do I know that this one identifier is actually owned by the SAC? So that's more of an authentication problem that we try to solve. And then the second one, the human trust problem, is more knowing the authority, right? So once I've been able to authenticate an identifier against a legal entity if I want to do so, how do I know that they're actually allowed or have authority to do what they're doing? How do I know that the SAC is actually an authoritative party to issue a digital credential? So these are all key pieces of the digital trust infrastructure that we're trying to unlock. And so how do I know a claim has accurate representation? So this is that second bullet point that has to do with authentication. So I have a credential exchange example here. You could see that the trust spanning protocol, and if anyone is familiar with a protocol called like DIDCOM, for example, this is kind of something that has a lot of similarities to trust spanning. I could use an identifier, I could build a connection between two entities, and over this I could do trust tasks like signing, issuing a credential, presenting a credential. And the thing that's quite interesting with this model, which I'm sure folks have seen this model or are familiar with it, is that it's decentralized in nature, meaning that when the verifier verifies a proof coming from the holder, they don't necessarily need to go back and talk to the issuer of that. So that's where it's a bit of a different model than what exists today, where there's an identity service provider or there's a call home. This has much more privacy baked in, much more confidentiality baked into this interaction. And so one of the decentralized identifiers, and there's close to 200 of them that exist today, different types of methods, but one that's very popular that we're seeing is one called DIDWeb. DIDWeb is a type of decentralized identifier, which is popular for public entities that are saying, hey, I want my identity to be known. I don't mind. If I'm just a citizen, I don't necessarily want to have my identifier public to the world. So I'll use a different type of method so that's more private to me. I could generate them as I go. I could have more privacy this way. But if I'm an organization, like a government entity or an enterprise, I don't mind. I'm already a public organization. I want people to know about me. I want them to know that they could talk to me through this mechanism right here. So DIDWeb. And so what we started looking at, and I'll just preface this with saying that at Northern Block we've been working with an organization called CIRA, which is the registry for all of the .cas. So there's over 3 million .cas that are registered. They have specific requirements in them, like they need to be owned by Canadian residents or Canadian-based organizations and stuff like that. So they have good governance built into this. They're advocates for a security tool called DNSSEC. So I won't get into the details. I'm not the DNSSEC expert here, but all I could say is that it provides more cryptographic trust. There's a root of trust, which if I sign records using this type of cryptography, there's more trust that someone hasn't taken over my server, taken over my domain. There's trust baked in that I am who I say I am, and I can prove it technically through cryptography. So what we've been doing with this organization, CIRA, is that we're saying, hey, when someone wants to resolve a claim, they're going to go using that decentralized identifier through a DID document. There's information in the DID document. So if I go back a couple slides here, you see that the issuer is publishing certain information to a place. And then when the credential is being resolved, they get the instructions of, hey, go there to resolve it. And there's different types of implementations for this. In DIDWeb, it's on a web server. So they'll go to the web server, they'll get this DID document, and in this document there's certain information about the issuer, certain endpoints if they want to talk to it, valuable information if you want to cryptographically verify a credential claim. And what we're doing in here is we're able to add signatures from the issuer in this document. And what we've done, which is pretty cool, is we're saying, well, if I'm the SAC, I should have checked this out. I don't know exactly what the SAC's website is, but if we just say SAQ.ca, within the server of SAQ.ca, they're able to write a proof, put a signature in there, but backed by DNSSEC. So I have a lot of confidence that it's actually the SAC. I have confidence that they own this website. So it kind of adds a second layer of security. It's kind of like multi-factor authentication. So now I've been able to see within the information about the decentralized identifier that the signature there matches the signature in the DNS root zone. I have a little bit more confidence. It's an interesting multi-factor authentication method to know that, hey, I think the claim has accurate representation. They're claiming that it was issued from the SAC. I've now done a double check against their DNS zone, and I have much more confidence here. But we haven't answered that third question, right? Which is more of another human trust question, but more authorization. How do I know that the SAC is authorized to issue a credential? And there's been a lot of work happening in Canada. There's a lot of good thought leaders in Canada in this space, but globally as well, and things are starting to become more standardized around the whole concept of a trust registry, which is an authoritative list of issuers, of verifiers, of whatever really. So you have these kind of systems of record, sources of truth that I may want to go ask, hey, are they actually a registered issuer of this thing? I'm being told I have a minute, so I'll quickly finish. So did the issuer of this credential have authority to issue it? I now know that it's most likely the SAC that issued it. Do they have authority if I don't know if they're allowed to issue it, And so this is where we're looking to use similar mechanisms, and we're testing out trust registry solutions and equipping trust registries with decentralized identifiers just like any other person we saw issuer, holder, verifier would have. So what we're doing is we're imagining that, hey, a trust registry is just another entity. Why don't we treat them the same way? Why don't they have a decentralized identifier? Why don't we use these cool digital trust mechanisms like the trust spanning protocol to be able to interact with a trust registry? Why can't I ask a trust registry a question, which was one of those trust tasks that I listed earlier on my slide? And once I ask them the question, I could do a similar type of check against the DNS records. If I see that they have a DNSSEC signed DNS record, I'll have much more confidence that it's the proper authority that's running the trust registry, and I should be able to answer this third question that a claim has been issued by an authority. This is R&D. It's interesting stuff that we're playing around with, but I hope that the concepts kind of made sense. And really what I was trying to get across in this presentation is that we're developing these digital trust solutions, but there's tons of existing security, privacy, authenticity, confidentiality solutions that exist out in the wild today. By combining them together, we can increase the levels of assurance and we could get to digital trust quicker. And a plug for, if anyone's interested in this subject in general, I have a podcast, I mentioned it earlier. Please check it out and I hope you'll like it. Thank you very much.